three.
Tea is ready. Mike is ready. I'm ready. But as you know, the important question is, are you ready? Hey, welcome to the Mykel Broady Podcast. I am Mykel Broady. Thank you for listening today. This is the finale for our amazing second season Oxymoronic Gems, 7th episode in the season, 13th episode overall. I'm glad to continue seeing this number grow. I'm just thankful for the opportunity, and I'm thankful that you're here to listen with us today. This is a listener feedback episode part 2. As a reminder, if there's some new listeners here, each and every season I want to do a listener feedback episode at the end of the season to not only get your thoughts, to really hear your feedback on how maybe the content inspired you, encourage you to learn more. It was able to fulfill your appetite for curiosity in some sense. And that's what this place is for. But also not just that, to reflect and understand that although this season is ending, the conversation still continues, and hopefully the growth is still evident in your own life. I must say, this is a bit of a different listener feedback episode. Typically, there would be some audios from listeners, and we would almost have like a conversation like you saw with part 1. However, this time around, I didn't receive a ton of audios from the listeners. And so I think this makes it a great time to say, call to action for more. I would encourage you, if you've ever listened to the podcast and have felt inspired, have felt curious while listening to it, have felt challenged even in your thinking, and it really stretched your mind to think of something in a different way, I would encourage you, I heavily encourage you to reach out and share your thoughts. This platform is your podcast too. As we talk about in the story Inspiring Now, it's my podcast for a reason. Not just me as in Mykel Broady, but you as a listener. You have a voice, and I hope that you use the resources we have in place for you to do so. With that being said, in many ways, these listener feedback episodes are also times of reflection in which I hope to unpack and share many off-the-mic moments with you as a listener. What are off-the-mic moments? There's 3 different ways I think of off-the-mic moments. One could be my approach heading into an episode. So you kind of saw a sneak peek of this during the last episode we did, episode 6 on season 2 with Chris Macarthur. But I was able to kind of share with you ahead of time how I approached it, where my mind was at when I initially thought about the topic and the place that I felt that may be best for us to go from there. You'll hear that. You also hear lessons learned along the way. We all know there's tons of those. Far more many lessons that, I learned from just doing the podcast than what you actually hear. Also, countless moments of gratitude. I'm just forever grateful, for this podcast, this platform that I have to uplift others. And I'm actually excited to chat more about that in this conversation today. This all leads me to this kind of realization I had preparing for this episode in particular. What you hear on the podcast, my voice right now, hello, hey, is only about 20% of it. Now, don't ask me the math behind how I figured out 20%. That's just a random number, a guess. But honestly, I feel like what you hear is very little as it relates to what that podcast actually is composed of. And so I'll go into that briefly here before we get into some of the episodes. I like to think of the podcast as, kind of a composition of one, probably the biggest part, lives of contributors. My life, the lives of guests that I bring onto the show. Before, when I started this, I would have people ask me, how do you plan on keeping up with content? Is there any way you can truly talk about something for multiple seasons? And I would look at them and say, yeah, that's easy. We live the content. The content is our lives. It's the lessons that we learn along the way, this lifelong journey of learning we're on. And so that's a huge part of the podcast. And sometimes we don't see that, right? We don't see Andre Love fighting these battles behind the scenes. But thankfully for us, we get to see not necessarily the finished product, but a product of him growing, right? His growth and how he's done so far. On top of this, another composition, a huge part of the podcast is editing. Now, editing, it's kind of weird for me because I never wish to edit the podcast in a way that strips it of its authenticity. And what I mean by that is I like to leave in there sometimes the ums and the ahs and like maybe the stutters. I like to leave those things in there at times because it is authentic. It's how this conversation is. And for you as a listener, I want you to know, as it relates to editing, although I break some things down, I never take away who someone is. My goal in editing is never to hide imperfections. Let me put it that way. It's never to hide imperfections. When I approach editing, it's always in a way of what's going to make this a very digestible listen for you as a listener. What is going to make this relatable to you? What is going to make this as if it's speaking directly to you, of course? What is going to make this a resource for you to use on your journey of learning? That's how I approach editing. And so know that when you hear these episodes, they aren't heavily edited at all. I don't take out a bunch of stuff for no reason. I take out stuff if maybe it's some of the conversation elements that we may not want. So if there's a moment of pause, I might shorten that pause. If someone stutters a million times, I'm sure they might not want to stutter a million times, and it may distract from your listening, and so I may cut out that stutter. Again, it's not necessarily in my mind. I don't think of it as me trying to make others look better and hide their imperfections. I just see it as me trying to create a episode, an audio recording that will be relatable to you and effective in the long term. And so editing's another huge part. Then you have promoting. That's the other huge element of the podcast. But I don't like to think of promoting in a way. Sometimes, look, I'm a huge fan of marketing, but sometimes promoting can be looked at in not the best of ways. How I think of it is, how can I reach you where you're at? So when I think of promoting the podcast, how is there ways that I can maybe create clips to make it more digestible for you? I know digestible seems to be the word of the podcast right now, but it's true, and it's fitting along with what we're talking about right now. But that's a goal that I have, is I want to meet the listener where they're at as much as I possibly can. I can't be everywhere, but if the podcast can be on a certain platform and touch people and inspire lives, I'm going to try my very best to get there. Another huge element of the podcast is ideating, right? Thinking about what are we going to talk about? And this has been incredibly fun. I've learned a lot about myself in doing so. I've learned a lot about strategy and making sure that what I'm saying is looping to something, is aligning to something broader, to maybe even something bigger than myself. It's aligning to, our core pillars on the Mykel Broady Podcast. That's pushing us forward on just an incredible mission, an unfathomable one at that, but one that's filled with much growth. And so those things are kind of the composition. Those make up the other 80%, perhaps, is, the lives of contributors, editing the podcast, promoting, ideating, but all are incredibly important. And so I mention that because this is my humble attempt every season to expose you to the other 80%. Because it's so good. There's so much quality in that time, in that 80%, that I want to share with you. Now, I know some people may be thinking right now, that might not be the best feeling in the world, knowing that, you only get 20% of a given work, of a platform, you only get 20% of something. But let me assure you, that 20% that you're getting is damn good. Because the other 80%, that's what fuels the 20% that you hear. And so what's so important for me, though, is I want to expose you to that other 80% so the 20% becomes more clear. So you understand the bigger picture behind it. So that you are just as involved in this journey as me to some extent, however possible. And so this is my attempt each and every season to bring you into the full picture of the Mykel Broady Podcast. And hopefully I can learn from you as well. If you have your own thoughts and ideas, please share them with me. And so with that being said, let's get into these episodes. Starting off with the first episode of this Oxymoronic Gem series, Expert Beginner with Chris Hess. This was a really unique episode. Of course, you heard birds, 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 but what I also heard was growth, growth, growth. And what I mean by that was the birds were not a planned thing. I wasn't trying to be overly poetic or anything with the birds. it really happened spontaneously. And actually, there was a lesson in itself, and it showed me that I was growing as a host. I was growing as a leader of this podcast because I was adaptable. I was able to, be agile, nimble as it related to dealing with some different issues. And so, for example, with this episode in particular with Chris, we were about to shoot the episode, but right before we were about to shoot, I realized, dang, I have workers at my house working on the bathroom, and they have, I don't know why, but at this point in time, when I was just about to start it, they had the loudest sounding tool that they were using at the time. And yes, there was a moment of brief panic. Now, I didn't let it sit for long, but there was a moment of like, oh shoot, like how I didn't think this through. And this wasn't kind of what I planned for. But I was really proud of myself because immediately, almost instantly, like I said, I had that brief moment of panic, but then immediately, probably 5 seconds, I was just, all right, we're going to do this outside. And so I moved my laptop, I moved the mic and everything, all my equipment outside, and that was something I never done before. And honestly, I was really proud of myself because think about it, it's hard to, if you are confident about something, it doesn't matter if you're doing it in the rain, if you're doing it in the snow, if you're doing it in sunny weather, you're going to make it happen. And that's how I felt, like the lesson I learned from that experience was I wasn't distracted or I wasn't caught off guard or I didn't restrict myself from bringing my full self to the table, from giving you my very all that episode, despite the circumstances being unexpected and unplanned for. If anything, as you know, one of the few certainties we have in life is uncertainty. And so I'm grateful that I had the ability to adapt to that quick change, and we ended up having a great episode. And so I wanted to say that. Birds, but yes, it was also growth. I also just really enjoyed having Chris on the show. He is obviously an example of a lifelong learner. He talked a lot, and I don't mean that in a bad way, but it was really encouraging hearing him talk because all of that came from passion. Every single word he said came from, a place of just raw passion and being an expert beginner himself. And trust that every word he said, he wants you to be better. Every single thing, every single gem that Chris dropped, it's because he loves sharing new things with others. So I love that Chris was able to do that. Thank you, brother, for doing so. On top, another thing I wanted to share with this episode was really bringing back to light what Chris said about embracing incremental gains. I thought that was, to sum it up that way, it sounded really cool and helpful and applicable to me. And I would say for you as a listener, a great place to start as it relates to that is to just be proud of yourself. So much, in society, especially in American society, small wins are not really a thing. As Chris said, we are dopamine-driven individuals. We want a big win, and we want to celebrate. And that's what society tends to celebrate oftentimes, not those small wins, not the fact that you did 5 extra pull-ups today than you did yesterday. That's not the big win that often gets celebrated. But I say for you, let it be. Celebrate it with all your might. That's an incredible accomplishment. And that is the path to growth. It is very hard if we are judging our growth off of where we're growing exponentially or not, because that's just not going to be the case. Sometimes you got to be grateful for growing centimeters. Sometimes you got to be grateful for just doing 2 extra push-ups. And guess what? You are getting better. No matter how small the results may feel, you are absolutely getting better. And I'm proud of you, but more importantly, I hope that you are proud for yourself, and I encourage you to do so onwards. Another thing I thought was great from that episode was the Sisyphus Condition, really bringing that back to light. And for those who may not be aware, who may not have been able to hear the episode in its entirety, the Sisyphus Condition, it represented a study that was done by Dan Ariely, where they had 2 different groups. One was considered the meaningful condition. And so what this meaningful condition did, they would build some type of Lego figures, and they could see their progress as they built more and more. And obviously they were trying to track who was going to build more, this meaningful group or the second group, which is the Sisyphus Condition, who built Lego figures but couldn't see their progress. So they would build one, but as they're building the second, boom, now the first one is destroyed. You're going to use those pieces to build whatever many. But the point being, you couldn't see your progress in that state. And after they did the numbers and looked at who built more Legos, it was the meaningful condition group who did. The group that were able to see their progress over time, built more Lego figures in the grand scheme of things over those who couldn't see their progress. And so this is just emphasizes the need for us to keep track and build off of past victories. And those past victories could be anything, right? Tangible works. So maybe you aspire to have your own fashion company. Well, take pride in those little small wins that you enjoy along the way. You know, when you're coloring in your coloring book, take pride in those drawings that you have there and put them up on the wall. That's a small win. Side note, love you, Mom. Another thing, meaningful moments, right? Maybe you had a very meaningful moment with someone and you want to cherish this. Write it down on a note card. Write it down. I've been doing this myself and it's been very helpful. And I say this because with these small moments, with these small wins, we may forget about them. And so that's why I bring to light this idea of using a note card to keep track of your victories so that you can see your progress over time and you can build off of it. I encourage everyone to look further into the Sisyphus Condition and that study that Dan Ariely did. I want to move on now to episode 8, Lowest Highs with Jessica Brody, my mother. I know for sure that this episode changed someone's life. I know that for sure. I'm not going to say who, but I know an individual in my life who that absolutely changed their perspective. You know, they were in a tough time. They weren't really able to see the light, you know, at the end of the tunnel. But through listening to the podcast, through understanding that they have the power to change their perspective, that no matter what they're going through, frame it in the sense of it being a high. Find what you are grateful for. And it was an honor to just see how much that meant to that person who maybe was on the brink of leaving this planet. Maybe who had enough, who just didn't know how they could fight any further. The fact that this podcast meant so much to them, it moved them to tears. It moved them, more importantly, to act, to better themselves. I am honored. And honestly, this reaffirms my belief in the need to give my best and be fully grateful for each and every listener. You know, no matter if it's 5, 50, 500, 5,000, 50,000, 500K, or 5 mil plus, I will give you my very best. And when I say that, I've really had to challenge myself. I've asked myself many times, if thousands or even millions were listening to this, would I approach it differently? And I got to be honest, there's been times I had to be bluntly honest with myself and say, yeah, maybe I would. Maybe I would prepare a little bit harder. Maybe I would, think a little bit differently in terms of how I would promote this. But why wait? Why wait? Do it now. And that's what I had to tell myself was, let's get on it. Let's show the same respect to every single listener, because that's how I perceive it. If my action as a host, if how I approach the podcast changes just because now there's 5 million people listening rather than however many there is now, that's being disrespectful to the current listeners, to you listening right now. And since you are listening right now, you are the first to know I'm giving you my very best. I'm asking, these questions, these open-ended questions to myself because I want to be the best for you. You deserve it. Not when all the people may be chanting, all right, Mykel Broady Podcast is great. It's popular. I don't care. Right now, I just want to speak to you because that's how I came in this. I didn't come in here saying, I want millions of people to listen to my podcast and I'm doing it for the fame. Hell no. And if that's ever my stance, then this podcast will no longer exist. You have my word. I'm here to impact lives in an authentic, genuine way. And whether that's one life, as if we saw with this episode in particular, job finished. Job was done. And I'm thankful for the opportunity to do so. So thank you as a listener who's listening in this early stage for rocking with me. I'm telling you, I'm giving you my very best. And I'm proud to see where we're going moving forward. And I'm happy that I can show you my journey of growth. And I'm excited, hopefully, to hear more about yours as well. Looking at this episode too, I was also really proud of my ability to just share my financial struggles from the past semester. And the reason being is because that's really what kept me pushing when I was struggling financially. There would be days where, my stomach's growling and I'm just like, I'm mad kind of at society. Like, why am I suffering this? Why am I enduring this? I'm a hard worker. I'm doing the work every single day. But then instead of saying, why me, I said, thank you. Thank you, because I understand now. I understood at that time that my task was to be fully present, was to be absolutely fully present so I can notice any type of issues, any areas, any hurdles, so that I may be in a position one day because I know this is temporary. I know the financial struggles are temporary. But when I get out of this, I am excited to help those that may not have been as fortunate as me. And so I'm thankful. I was really just inspired to heading into that conversation because it was like the reason I fought came to life. I had the opportunity to really inspire others. I don't know. I didn't hear much about if that affected people, but I trust it did. And I trust it still will moving forward, even well after this listener feedback episode drops. My hope was, and honestly, and still is, to speak directly to those who may be in a similar situation. To those who may have been struggling financially too, but just couldn't figure out how should they approach it. It seemed too big. I wanted to speak to those individuals and let them know that they got it. Let them know that they're there for a reason right now. And let them know that they're going to change lives moving forward. I heard a tremendous quote from Candace Matthews, who is a Becca member, a Black Executive CMO Alliance member. And she mentioned, we are constantly trailblazing for others. That's what you're doing right now. You are trailblazing for other people, whether you know it or not. And it's a beautiful thing. Looking back on the episode, I was also grateful for the opportunity to bring my mom on, to elevate her energy while exposing you to much of my origin. I love my mom so much, and as you could hear from the episode, she's very positive, very uplifting, always trying to find the bright side in everything, glass half full type of gal. And so I appreciated bringing her onto the podcast to share with you what I've been exposed to my whole life. This is the origin of me. When you see me, see her. When you think about my greatness, think about hers first and foremost, because this is the origin. She is the origin. And so I was really happy to bring her on because it's almost like adding another piece to the puzzle. Oh, this makes sense why he's that way. I love you so much, Mom. Thank you for encouraging me. Thank you for pushing me to be better each and every day. And thank you for being on the podcast for that episode in particular. Moving on now to episode 9, Certain Uncertainty with Andre Love. Gosh, obviously all the episodes are incredible. This one has moved me to tears many times. And I was just so incredibly proud of Dre. Someone who was just so authentic, so honest with you. It was beautiful. Someone who's so vulnerable. It's really easy to talk about things you went through, maybe, the bad things or the negative things, if you want to call it that, once it's far past, once you already took care of it long ago. But it's a whole different beast when you're bringing it up on a broad platform while you're still going through it. That is just another level of strength that I didn't think to be exposed to until Dre brought it to me. And so I want to say I'm incredibly proud of you, Dre. The fact that you were so honest with our listeners, that you would share with them, look, I don't got it all figured out. I'm still learning myself, to be honest with you. I'm just pushing forward. That's all I know, is I'm still giving it my very best. I don't have the answers. I don't have the blueprint. But what I can tell you is just keep fighting and being you. Dre, that is beautiful. And you are a king. You are a warrior. Thank you. It was also interesting with this episode because I had to change up my approach a bit. Speaking of hearing Dre's story, it wouldn't have been available if I didn't have to reconsider how I approached these podcast episodes. You see, in the past, a lot of times, they weren't really interview based. So what I mean by that is it wasn't the whole, all right, well, let's get into your journey. Let me have some guided questions to take us through the conversation. But rather it was, all right, here's a topic. And let's just, both of us, just being absolute fans of the topic, let's just talk about it. But what I realized over time was that wasn't specific enough, right? And it didn't tap into a hidden gem in the Mykel Broady Podcast, which is bringing to light beautiful stories of individuals growing. And so I had to change my approach. How could I do that? what I thought was, okay, if I know their stories ahead of time, why don't I create questions that, kind of piece it apart. So before I even create questions, I should say, I'll piece apart their journey. So, okay, well, Dre, you had the first trucking accident. Then you had the second accident. Okay, then you had afterwards when he was recovering. I broke it into different segments and then created targeted questions for each segment so that we can perfectly guide us throughout the conversation, rather than leaving it heavily open-ended and just being like, well, tell me about, the past year. He could have went a million different places. You could have been lost, and he may have not have been able to get his point across. But by really taking ownership and accountability as a host and creating the right questions that will guide not only our conversation, but your understanding of our conversation as a listener, that was what I was after. And that's what you heard in this episode in particular, is where I really started to initiate that, to have those targeted questions. And I think that really helped guide our conversation, and it's easier to take things away as well. And so episode 9, Certain Uncertainty, was just very special. Again, thank you, Dre, for being a part of it. Episode 10, Irrationally Irrational with Jessica Brody. I guess I need to bring up, why did I bring her back so soon? Well, I think it started off with Law's desire. When I say Law, I mean LaWanda Stone, who was on the podcast for season 1. But Law reached out to me after she listened to that episode, and she said she needs to hear more of Ma. So it was really built by Law's desire to hear more of Ma. As soon as she said it, I feel a sense of my pride got the best of me. And because the first word she said to me when we hopped on that call was, I wish I would have heard more of Jessica. And I think a sense of pride kind of crept up because my story was on display. And also, you still heard a bit about my mom. And so to come at me first and say that, it was kind of like a slap in the face. And then because of that, I ended up giving her the wrong response. I told LaWanda, well, I think honestly my mom was just a little bit nervous. I think she was too nervous at the time, and maybe she didn't expand on some answers. But she had the opportunity to say so. And that was my response to LaWanda initially. And even just saying that now, I'm not the happiest with myself in that and doing so. But it doesn't end there, because later on, as we approached the second episode, I knew I had to take ownership. I didn't set my mom up for success the first time around. We talked about the targeted questions I had for Dre. There were no targeted questions for my mom. In fact, I later realized I didn't even give my mom an outline for that episode. I gave everyone an outline of kind of what to expect in our conversation, and I failed to do so for my mom in that situation. And so this was completely on me. You didn't hear a lot. Maybe if you were like Law, you didn't hear enough of my mom the first time around, and I take full ownership as the host, as the creator. I needed to do a better job in setting my guest up for success, and I'm happy we were able to do so with this episode. We were well overdue to hear her profound story of having my brother and I at 15 and 18, and it tied perfectly into the topic, but also she just got done watching The Secret and was just so inspired. And honestly, I was inspired by her telling me, you can have whatever you wish for, and whatever you dream, you can have that. And we got to thinking, my mom and I, we got to thinking about our past and how we've been applying the law of attraction for many years. There's millions of examples. I'm exaggerating there. There's tons of examples when I applied the law of attraction. And so it fit well also to this idea of being rationally irrational. Because, as you know, to say you can have whatever you desire, some people would say that's too naive. Sure, but have these people ever seen the law of attraction at work? I would ask. Have they ever pursued something bigger than themselves and believed that they could actually achieve it, despite all the odds stacked against them? And that's why we had to have Mom back on the podcast. Law's desire to hear more of her. We were well overdue to hear her profound story, and after she watched The Secret, it just perfectly aligned for us to do this episode. And I loved it. I loved sharing, being able to hear more about kind of how she dealt with that initially. I haven't heard some of the elements that she shared at that time. Yet again, in that episode, her positivity rang true. Her positivity shined like no other. And that's where I come from. Again, that's my origin. And I'm so thankful to be surrounded by so much love, positivity, and peace to push me forward. I hope you learned a ton from that episode. Moving on to episode 11, Entry-Level Leaders with Naren Gursahani. I thought this one was so cool for many reasons, but one, I think it was the perfect emphasis on how the guest embodies the topic at hand. And so I guess this brings me to a good segue on the process for selection. How do I select guests to come onto the podcast? Might be a question that may have been on your mind at some point this season. I feel like my process for selection is honestly one of the many elements that make this podcast unique. And so in doing so, I don't just bring on guests because they have great titles or because they're really eager to promote themselves or because I realize, if I have them on the podcast, maybe my numbers will go up dramatically. I don't do things for that. I promise you I never will. That's not how we run things here. Rather, instead, the process of how I typically select the guests, when I'm ideating, when I'm thinking about the upcoming season, I have a topic in mind, right? Well, I have an overall theme in mind, and then I create episodes that match that theme. But in doing so, when I come up to a topic that matches that theme in the series, I immediately just start thinking about people in my network, my village, as I like to call it. Who there represents it. And that's how I choose. I'm never letting people on here that I have no awareness of. Everyone that comes onto this podcast, I've known them thoroughly. And I've spent time to truly know their journey and their desire to uplift others. And the positivity that they bring every single time we chat. And so that's what you see. And honestly, it's kind of like my secret sauce. And someone say, well, is it really secret now? You can't mess with great bonds. You can't mess with chemistry. You can't mess with someone who's already fought that battle and won. So yeah, I guess it's not secret sauce anymore, but you still can't mess with it. And I was just thankful to have Naren on. In fact, a kind of a funny backstory ahead of time. I told him, all right, entry-level leaders, really big on destroying the spotlight. And Naren got back to me and was like, what is, really intriguing episode it sounds like, but what does destroying the spotlight mean? And I know that's kind of like a random phrase I put together, and it can sound a bit aggressive like I talked about. But all I had to do was pull up an old article from Naren literally destroying the spotlight, an immediate interview. And so it was really great to see that come full circle. I know it meant a lot to Naren to know that he's a living example of this. You ain't got nothing to worry about as it relates to this episode, man. You've been living this. We're here to listen to you. And so I'm happy to have Naren on there. I encourage you to check out that episode, as of all the others as well. Thank you for asking. Moving on now to episode 12, Comfortably Uncomfortable with Chris Macarthur. This one was also a unique one. I like how we started off the season in a unique way, being outside. We've never done that before. And not that we ended it, but close to ended the season off in a different location. We were up in Lake Tahoe, and it was a great scene. I just appreciated, being in a different type of setting and taking the podcast out there. It was fun. It was different. And I actually do have feedback for this episode. And this feedback comes in the form of an Instagram comment from Chris's dad. I believe his name is Jared Macarthur, as it related to hearing his son on the podcast. And he said, I quote, "I don't listen to too many podcasts, but of course I love this one. I'll have to listen to more of your past episodes. Thanks for including Chris and sharing with me. I learned more about Chris and his adventure." And then he put a cool little emoji. I remember exactly which one, but I have here in my notes that he put a cool emoji, so that's funny that I added that. But that meant so much to me, seeing that comment. And just like I kind of mentioned with Lowest Highs, that affected one life. My job was done. Yeah, I did my job. Of course, you want to impact as many lives as possible, but I'm not going to focus on quantity when quality's already there. It affected Jared Macarthur. So much so that he learned more about his son. And I'm sure they probably talked about the trip before, but I was able to ask him questions maybe that he wouldn't have thought about asking his son. Maybe that his son didn't think about responding in a certain way until he was on this podcast and he had the opportunity to do so. Because just think about it. Put yourself in Jared's shoes for a second. Sitting down, listening to the podcast, just feeling, I tend to think about the pride he felt at the time. The excitement he had for his son, who is on a new path, on a new journey of growth and development and adulthood. And so, Jared, thank you for your feedback, and I'm glad that the podcast resonates with you and you're encouraged to check out more episodes, but more importantly that, you learn more about your son. Your son is an extraordinary man, and he will do incredible things for himself and others. Also, another segue, speaking of Chris, he learned about himself. I reached out to Chris shortly after we did our episode, and actually, no, he reached out to me and said, I just listened to it, and it was really great. Thank you again for the opportunity. And he said, I learned a lot about myself, too. And that was huge. Like you're learning about yourself when talking about your own journey to me. And I think that just emphasizes the power of conversation, the power of getting some of these thoughts, these thousands of thoughts that we have in our head, making them tangible and speaking through it so that we can clearly see who we are, because we can see our thoughts. And so I loved that there was so much support and awareness of Chris's evolution following that episode. Well, it appears that I've ran out of episodes for the season at this point, but what to expect moving forward? Well, as much as I'd like to leave you this season with all the fun details on what to expect for Season 3, I understand it mutually serves us best in the long run to think critically about our best course of action and get back to you then. However, that's not to say that there aren't a few things I can share now. And so what I can share with you is something exciting on what to expect. Expect more effort towards social media. As we talked about earlier with promotion, I want to find more ways to reach you where you're at. I know for everyone it may not be the most convenient to listen to a 50-minute episode. Maybe you haven't made it a habit enough to see how you could do so. Maybe you listened to it once for 15 minutes and then you had to do something and you never had a chance to pick it back up. How can I find a way to bring digestible, short clips to you, short form content, so that you can still learn and grow with us despite where you may be at this point in time? On top of that, right now I can see my beautiful face. Yes, I'll call my face beautiful, but you don't. But expect that to change moving forward, because I will be adding video to the Mykel Broady Podcast. I'm very excited for this because as much as it's good to probably hear my voice and to hear the voice of our guests, there's nothing like seeing the big smile of LaWanda Stone, the dimples on my mother, the laughs that I share with my guests, and we're going to bring all of this to the front of your screen for Season 3. Lastly, the other thing I want to share with you in terms of really what to expect, new additions to the podcast onwards. Expect more collaboration. Expect me to have more collaboration with my village in the creative process. I realize this podcast is a beast, man. In terms of creating ideating the content, then creating the content, editing the content, promoting the content, maintaining the content. Like, there's so many different pieces to it. And I don't want to do it alone. And I have no shame in saying that. In fact, this podcast is only going to get better when I open it up, when I let go and I share it more with other people, and I get their thoughts and their opinion. Some people may say, well, what about mission drift? You think it'll drift away from your mission in doing so? Absolutely not. Because what I say, I'm meeting with my village, the people that are consistently helping me learn and get better. And so they're aware of what I'm going for already, and they're aligned to the Mykel Broady Podcast mission as well. So that's what you can expect. As we wrap up, I know I have a challenge to give, right? A challenge to all listeners, and my challenge is pretty simple. I challenge you to challenge yourself. Right? I can give you a million challenges on the Mykel Broady Podcast, but honestly, the best challenge that you can ever receive is the one that you give yourself. And in doing so, as you're pursuing it, remember that you're an expert beginner, right? Like we talked about episode 1 in the season. You're an expert beginner. Those small incremental gains that you'll take to get better each and every day. And guess what? Sometimes when you're challenging yourself, it's going to feel weird, right? You might even be hit with a lot of barriers, and it may be overwhelming at times. It may feel you're at a low, potentially. But you are in what we call the lowest highs. All right, so change your perspective a bit on that. But as you're changing your perspective, it's still kind of hard, right? And you're going to find a time where things are popping up different. If you're challenging yourself and seeing new things, there's things that are going to be uncertain. But guess what? One of the few certainties we have in life is uncertainty. Just like we discussed in episode 3 with certain uncertainty. And as you're doing this, as you're pursuing, pushing, fighting through this uncertainty, do so irrationally. Be rationally irrational, right? Like we talked about in episode 10. Understand that doing the same thing and expecting a different result is the definition of insanity. So don't do that. In order to be different, you have to think different. And as you're doing this, conquering these challenges, remember to be an entry-level leader, but not necessarily in the business sense, but just in terms of being inclusive towards those that may not be on that level. Maybe there's someone who, as we touched on earlier, you're always trailblazing for someone else. There's someone else that wants to do something else. There's someone else that wants to do kind of what you did in their own unique way, right? In a way that's exciting for them. Inspire them. Let them know that they don't need to replicate you, that they have their own beautiful, profound way that they're trailblazing the path for other people. And lastly, you should know that challenging yourself once is not the expectation, but you should make a habit of it. And it's uncomfortable, but we always wish to be comfortably uncomfortable, as we talked about in one of the last episodes for the season. This is Oxymoronic Gems. Challenge yourself. And in doing so, be an expert beginner. See that it's just the lowest high. Embrace the uncertainty. While embracing the uncertainty, be irrational in the process. Be a leader for those. Inspire them to find their own unique way to do so. And make a habit of doing this over and over again. Thank you for listening to Oxymoronic Gems. It was a great season. I'm very thankful for the growth I was able to see, not only in my love for the podcast, but in my relationship with the listeners, my relationship with you. I'm encouraged for what the future holds. Continue to learn and grow with me. The journey's a lifetime. Have a tremendous morning, afternoon, evening, whenever you find yourself listening to this. Thank you for your time and energy. All the best. Let's hit that music that we all love. Let's get it right now. Here I go.